Welcome to Sage at Kapiolani Community College. I'm going to whip through these notes on processing account payable as quick as I possibly can because they're huge. Anyhow, there's a lot of moving parts in accounts payable, so we want to get a good look at all of them. First thing is when you're doing accounts payable transactions and processing, you're going to be generating information that you can extract out again through items like the aged invoice report, trial balance report, accounts payable trial balance report, your cash requirements report, and then the check history report. Also, you can always drill into items if you know what the item is ahead of time by going to vendor maintenance and clicking on the invoices tab and zooming down through the invoices. You can do an account payable history drill down, and also the checks. You can do the zoom button and check history drill down. Now, everything you've done in Sage, if you haven't gotten the idea already, uh, is maintained in an audit trail, meaning you can't go back and change things after the fact. You can only do additive processes, which means you can modify uh, some previous item only through, for example, deleting it, and which isn't truly a deletion, but is a deletion with a trail, and other credit memos, debit memos, things like that, or adjustments. So once you start entering a transaction, you have to update it by the end of the period, or your invoice and check entry are still going to be considered in process, and you won't be able to do period end if you haven't completed all of these procedures because they're considered in process and they want to be done before the period end occurs. Now, when you're doing invoice data entry, we're doing again batch posting. So you can take any number of invoices or credits or adjustments that you want and you group them in there and post them all at one time. And all of your entries in each batch, unless you assign a new batch number, are kept in that one bucket, that one batch. And each batch is segregated from each other, unless a person with supervisory privileges goes ahead and merges them. Um, Now, you can have multiple people doing the same kind of stuff at the same time, and you can determine a batch size ahead of time or do input control totals so that you can check to make sure that your output is coming out, the output of your input registers is coming out correctly. You can do private batches, and the batch number itself doesn't really mean anything. So, for example, if you had batch number 4 showing in the text, and then when you assigned a batch, it was batch number 5, it really wouldn't matter. It would just mean that you'd used up one before. And as I showed you in class, you can go back and grab an old one. So remember, if you've not really used it, you can go ahead and key in the number of the batch that you want, and then kind of repurpose that for whatever you'd like to use it for, just as I showed in class. So there's some really strange things in accounts payable. For example, the transfers. Purchase transfers are for flagging a specific vendor that we already made a purchase for using a credit card. And typically we'll want to do this because they're a 1099 vendor. So if you recall correctly, a 1099 vendor is one that is non-incorporated and we've purchased goods or used their services for more than $600, paid them basically more than $600 during the year, then we have to issue them a 1099. So if we've been using a credit card, we've been paying the credit card company according to Sage. And so what we have to do is like find that company and then tag them as having been paid because the credit card company is not going to um, carry through their identity to our 1099 procedures. So we're flagging them to be picked up in 1099 processing routine. So what the sequence is, somewhere along the line, you did a credit card charge from them, and then we show that we owe the credit card company for various line items like this expense or that expense or whatever. And then what we do is we go in and flag that specific vendor. So all this really does is it copies it from the credit card vendor, the actual line item itself, to the actual pay that was paid by the credit card. So they've already been paid. So nobody's going to get paid more or less or anything. It's just going to flag that vendor as having been a 1099 vendor. And then when we do our 1099 generation at year end or at the beginning of next year for the previous year, we will pick them up as one of our 1099s and issue them a 1099. Now, invoice transfer is not the same thing as purchase transfer. Invoice transfer is for deciding that we want to go ahead and pay somebody with a credit card instead of doing with a check routine. And so we may have called them up because we were late or something and given them our credit card number over the phone or done a website thing or what have you. And so we are now going to not pay with our normal accounts payable check procedures. We have are paying with a credit card. So we have the invoice sitting there, and then we go ahead and we indicate that we have paid that invoice with a credit card. So what this does is instead of their invoice still sitting there under them, now it becomes the credit card's uh, invoice to be paid. And we're not going to issue a check to them anymore because their invoice has been recorded as paid by the credit card. Now, when one of the most troublesome things is when you update things before you're supposed to update them. So when you print your invoice register after having input your accounts payable invoices, you want to make sure you check your work thoroughly. You might have the wrong vendor, you might have the wrong division, you might have the wrong description, you might have the wrong account distribution, you might have the wrong amount. You have to check every single little thing and do it now while you can still fix the errors. This is your last chance to actually be able to change anything. So say you accidentally click yeah on something that pops up, you just didn't even think, you just click yeah. When you go in and you say, you ask for invoice register, um, and it says invoice register file empty, that means you don't have any invoices that are currently active. What do you mean? I was just inputting it. Well, you just said update somewhere along the line. And you're not going to be able to modify those invoices in that original creation screen anymore because you've already finalized the process. So update only when you're sure your data is good. That doesn't mean don't ever update. That means just make sure you double, triple check your work before you do the update. You, it's not to say that the liability can't be changed, but you'll have like a messy trail of how you had to fix it. You can't go back and do like a QuickBooksy deal and change the actual invoice amount other than through an additional procedure or an additional entry of some type. Cannot go back and change the original entry itself and make it look like it was perfect to begin with. It's basically just not going to happen. So check it before updating. Now, you can do corrections, obviously. Of course, corrections are always going to be needed here and there. Now, the system needs to know if it's a credit memo or a debit memo, and you do that by indicating with a dash and CM or DM, so credit memo or debit memo. And credit memo is a reduction, and so we're just using the standard terminology of the vendor, and they issue a credit memo. That means that we owe them less. And we're going to change the terms to no terms so it doesn't influence our aging. Debit memo is an increase, so if we did not record enough on the invoice, then or the vendor did not invoice us for enough, then they're going to generate an additional debit memo to indicate that they owe more. And if we've already input it, we don't really want to make a big deal out of it. Just enter it as a debit memo. Now, the system isn't really very smart, so when you check the lines tab to verify that your account distribution is the same as your original invoice, you need to do that to make sure that it doesn't give you an error message that the thing is out of balance. After you've updated and you want to change an original invoice, you can do adjustments. And you go to invoice data entry, you call up that original invoice, and then you get the adjust invoice on file window. And you can tag it like, say, you want to hold it, you want a separate check, you want to adjust the dollar amount up or down. And when it comes time to finally print the check, then you're going to do a print not the check, but print the invoice input record. You're going to print the invoice register and then check your work again so you can thoroughly make sure it's correct and fix it before you do the update. So same comment applies to the update as before. If you mess it up, you got to go back and do an additional procedure to record that you had to fix the work that you did poorly before. So you don't really like an ugly trail like that. Some special things, repetitive invoices. Repetitive invoices are recurring bills that the system will keep track of for us. It's always going to have the same line distribution, and then you can set up your self-selected select cycles and or self-defined select cycles. And you should keep some sort of a outside of system tracking so you know which ones have already been done for the current period and so forth. So basically you create it and then you select it. So when you create it, you define it, accept it, and if necessary, you'll modify it and accept it. And then when you recall it, you use repetitive invoice selection, and that turns that thing, basically a template that you had created, into an active invoice data entry item. So it's an invoice now on file. And you can clear your selection if you want to make changes to that original repetitive invoice. And you can go back and modify the actual invoice if you need, right straight there in invoice data entry. Again, print the invoice register, check your work really well. If you're sure it's correct, go ahead and update. Don't update till you're sure it's correct. Now, what happens when you update the actual invoice or the the invoice that you did the repetitive invoice selection on. It updates that invoice on file and increments your counters in terms of the billed to date, the unbilled balance, the date last billed, and the times billed. So don't go like clicking that thing like wild and selecting and selecting and selecting, because you can end up having incrementing it further than it actually should be. Also, checks, when we do an invoice payment selection, we're ready to generate checks, we can do auto selection through invoice payment selection. Maintenance is where we kind of fix things if we need to on the checks and printing them. And then there's also a special thing, a special separate section called manual check entry. So there's really three ways to pay vendors. First is check printing. You do invoice payment selection. Then if you need to, you do maintenance, and then you finally print it. So it's when you're planning on printing a big batch of checks, for example, like a semi-monthly mail out that you do. You also have paid, if you already paid a vendor with a handwritten check, then you can go to main and do manual check entry. So this is where you record after the fact checks that were written outside of the system, not generated by the system, but you're now inputting them to the system, let the system know what happened. Also, you can do a couple checks here and there through manual check entry and quick print. So example, somebody comes in, needs a check right now, don't do a whole big batch of stuff and select them. You just kind of input it and then go ahead and print like the couple checks right now. Now, there are some special cautions you have to watch out for in these things, so you want to pay special attention to that part when we talk about it. So when you do invoice payment selection, you can automatically or kind of semi-automatically select the invoices you want to pay. If it's automatic, then you can constrain your invoices and have the system do the work for you and pull up what it says you're supposed to pay. And then you click the proceed button to actually run that selection and pull them up. Now, if you do it kind of semi-automatically, you can click the select button, then you go in there and tag the things that you want. And it's going to pick up them up as they are now and drop them in your bucket of stuff to be paid. So you can do this to make more selections. You can change your criteria for automatic and do the select button. You can clear your selections. You can use it to clear all your selections and empty the entire bucket. That means everything you already selected, you got to select all over again. And then it's going to say invoice payment selection file empty because you just cleared it. But that allows you to start all over again. Now you cannot use this to clear only certain selections. So you've selected 12 checks and you just say, oh, one of them I don't want. You can't take the individual things out of the bucket here. You have to go ahead and use the check maintenance instead. And you can't use this to change the amount that you're going to pay. All you're doing is selecting what's on file, basically. So you have to go in and use maintenance to change the amount. Now, it says, do you want to print checks? Unless you actually want to print them, then do not do not print them now. Click no. And I don't do any previews because it may be set to like sense that you've done a print and not want to print again for you. So just trust that your input screen is okay. You don't really need to see the actual pre-check image. Now, when you do check maintenance, you use this to manually select invoices for payments. And you use your flashlight and you find vendors that have active selections. Those are like checks that are pending. And it's not going to pay attention to the vendor number field. So you're going to select the individual items and use this little tiny delete button to remove only one item, or click delete to remove all the items for that vendor. And for partial payment, you're going to select an entry in the line item and change the payment amount. So you're going to change the payment amount in the line area. Okay. Now you can use the vendor number lookup to pick any vendor, and you have to give them an entry number, and you're going to look up their invoice number. And for partial payments, you want to select an entry in the line area and change the payment amount again, just like before. And when it comes to check printing, make sure you have everything good. Rerun PDF your invoice payment selection register, and once you're sure that all your checks are set properly, select check printing, not preview or anything, and make sure to modify the check message or stub message. Every once in a while there's a sort of a artifact of somebody else's name on the check printings. It might cross over company lines. So make sure you put a little memo in there saying with your name in the stub message or check message field, so we know that that's your checks and you know that's your checks, especially if you're going to go ahead and print them out later on to an actual printer via PDF. So if you have errors, then you go to check printing and print checks already printed checkbox. So that allows you to go back and print them again. But you have to know to do that. Now, when you do the printing, you want to check your work before you do the update, because once you've said, yeah, all these checks look good, then it's time to update. Now those checks become a permanent record of what you've done. And any changes after that, you have to void and or issue another check. Now, if you get the message that says check register file empty, means your checks have already been updated. You can't modify or reprint them anymore because they're a permanent record. So, of course, be careful before you do the update procedure in check printing. Now, when you do manual check entry, this is probably one of the trickiest ones. You have to select your vendor and grab an outstanding invoice and an amount. And in the header amount, you're going to drop in the check amount and the check number, and because the check's already been issued. And then the lines tab, you're going to check the account distribution and change your payment amount to whatever it ought to be. So the payment amount is changed by changing what says invoice amount. It's not actually changing the invoice amount, you're changing the amount of the invoice you're paying, but that's the terminology they use. So you have to change the invoice amount. And it's not like the other window where you change the payment amount. If there's an amount in the check distribution balance, that means your distributions don't agree with the check amount. You entered in the header tab, so you got to go back and change the check amount in the header tab. And after you accept, you can use the forward and back buttons to move between the manual checks that you've entered. So kind of go back and review them for correctness before you do the check register and the update. Now, you really want to check your work at this point before you do any finalization of it. And remember, if it says manual check register file empty, that means you've already updated. You can't change them anymore. Now we also have this thing called a quick print. Quick print tells the system you're going to be doing like a check, basically, maybe a couple soon. And if you ask for the next check number, you're not in quick print anymore. So you just made a wrong turn. And if you don't click deal distribution only, you're going to have to select a vendor number and you're going to have existing invoice. So for like the one-off payment where you don't have an invoice on file, this is not going to work well once you don't click GL distribution only. So you have to pick it when it's like a cash vendor. And if you click on the lines tab, you can't click GL distribution anymore. You have to click cancel and start it again. So after you click accept, it's assumed you're going to be printing next. So the manual check printing window pops up. Don't go like knocking this out of your way. Either go ahead and do it or restart your process. If you cancel from the manual check printing process or even do a preview, you can go back. You got to go back to manual check entry and check number field and quick print again, basically kind of like redo it. Now, the print manual check register function is what you do to check your work, make sure it's good before you finalize it, and then when you update it, if the message says checks must be printed, means you still have a quick print check in process. You have to go back in there, find that one that you didn't get around to printing, and then print it first or delete it. And if you get the message that says manual check register file empty, that means you've already updated, so whatever you're trying to modify now or print out now, no longer available. When you do manual check entry, a couple other items here. If you want to do a prepayment, you enter some kind of unique code in the invoice number field, like they use PP in the book for prepayment, and you can match up that with the invoice later through accounts payable invoice data entry. And so you basically enter a purchase transfer, invoice transfer, the new invoice number after you enter the vendor number, and then click GL distribution and transfer and enter it as a AP invoice data entry. You want to reverse a check, avoid an issue check. Then you enter the check number field, and go to the lines tab, and that gives you your originally paid invoice, unless you click GL distribution only checkbox first. Then you enter the bank code, the check number, the date, and zero the dollar amount. If you want to do a negative invoice, a credit memo, and apply that to an invoice. So you want to apply the credit memo to the invoice so that the check number or the check amount gets generated in the correct net amount. Then you enter APP and then whatever number you want in the check number field. And that means I'm going to apply it. I'm not really making a check. I'm going to apply this invoice to that, this credit, for example, to that invoice. So what that does is that reduces the open amount of the outstanding invoice, doesn't print the check. It just now, when you next select that invoice for printing, it'll select the net amount to be printed, and then you'll have it. There you go. Thanks for listening. Bye now.